My name is Rebecca Parker. I'm 29 years old, and last year, my grandfather, the one person who truly cared for me, left me an inheritance of $1.2 million. My mother, who walked out on me as a child to chase after men and nights out, now wanted back in. Not for me, but for my money. When I refused to fund her endless gambling, she invited me to a family dinner. What I walked into, however, was an ambush. Lawyers waiting to strong-arm me into signing everything away. But as they handed me the papers, I simply smiled, knowing this was the moment that would change everything. Growing up in Portland wasn't easy. After my parents' bitter divorce when I was 8, my mother, Jean, chose endless parties and revolving boyfriends over actually being a mother. My father moved to New York, barely called, and never bothered to visit. But it was my grandfather, James Parker, who stepped in and became my only true family. A self-made man, he built his construction company from nothing, proving to me what hard work really meant. He never had much formal schooling, but his understanding of people in business always left me in awe. After the divorce, he convinced my mother that I should stay with him for a while she figured things out. What was supposed to be temporary turned into my permanent home, and I could never be more grateful for that. Our humble 3-bedroom house in the suburbs became my sanctuary. Some of my best memories were our weekend fishing trips to Trillium Lake. Grandpa would wake me up before dawn, and we'd drive in his old truck, always stopping at the same diner for pancakes before heading to the lake. Fishing teaches patience, he'd say, and life rewards those who know when to wait for the right moment. He was teaching me more than how to catch fish, though I didn't understand it at the time. Whenever I struggled with math homework, Grandpa would sit with me for hours, never once losing his cool. Numbers tell stories if you know how to listen, he'd explain. By high school, I was helping him with the bookkeeping for his business on weekends. That's where my love for accounting started. Meanwhile, my mother's visits grew fewer and farther between. She'd show up with extravagant gifts at Christmas or on my birthday, always with a new boyfriend in tow, but never staying long enough for any real conversation. She'd marvel at how much I had grown and promise we'd spend more time together, but then disappear for months at a time. Grandpa never said a bad word about her in front of me, but the way his lips tightened whenever she canceled plans spoke volumes. "Your mother loves you in her own way," he'd tell me. "Some people aren't built for everyday care. They're more like fireworks, bright, exciting, but fleeting." I went straight to college after high school, enrolling at Portland State to study business. But halfway through my sophomore year, reality hit. Financially, I was drowning. Even with scholarships and working part-time at a coffee shop, I couldn't make it work. Grandpa offered to help, but his business had been hit hard by the recession, and I couldn't bring myself to add to his burden. So, I dropped out, promising myself I'd return once I saved enough. I found a full-time job as a bookkeeper assistant at a local factory, moved into a tiny apartment with 2 roommates, and saved every penny I could. "Education never expires," Grandpa assured me when he saw my disappointment. "Sometimes the path takes longer, but the destination is worth it," he'd say. 3 years later, with his encouragement, I enrolled again, this time to pursue accounting. I was more focused, more determined, and honestly, a much better student at 23 than I was at 18. Then came the phone call that shattered my world. Grandpa had gone in for a routine checkup, only to be told he had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was devastating. Without hesitation, I moved back into my childhood home to care for him. I switched my courses online where possible, and my professors were incredibly understanding. Those final months with him were both a blessing and a heart-wrenching experience. We finally had the conversations we'd never had before, about life, death, regrets, and the pride he'd felt in his journey. "I've had a good run," he told me one evening as we sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset. I built something from the ground up, loved deeply, and had the privilege of raising you. That's more than most ever get." As his strength waned, our roles reversed. I became the caregiver, managing his medications, preparing his meals, and reading to him when his eyes grew too tired to follow the words. One evening, in a rare moment of clarity, he gripped my hand with surprising strength. "Rebecca," he said, his voice steady, using my full name as he always did when it was something serious. "I'm leaving everything to you, not just because you've cared for me, but because I trust you to honor what I've built. Promise me you'll use it wisely. Don't let your mother waste it all on her schemes and dreams." Through my tears, I promised, though the inheritance was the furthest thing from my mind. Grandpa passed away peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was a blur of faces, many from the construction industry, all there to pay respects to a man whose integrity was legendary. My mother arrived late, wearing a black dress that seemed more suited for a party than a funeral. She gave me a quick hug, her perfume overpowering, and whispered, asking when the will reading would take place. The reading was held the following week by Mr. Goldstein, Grandpa's lawyer and friend of 30 years. My mother sat next to me, nervously fiddling with her bracelet while checking her phone every few seconds. When Mr. Goldstein revealed that Grandpa had left everything to me, with only $50,000 for my mother, her gasp was unmistakable. "This can't be right," she said, her face flushing with anger. "James wouldn't do this to me. I'm his daughter." Mr. Goldstein, a man whose silver hair and calm demeanor exuded respect, simply adjusted his glasses and continued. The inheritance included $800,000 in investments, the family home valued at $350,000, and Grandpa's classic car collection worth around $100,000. There were also personal items with great sentimental value, his old watch, fishing gear, and the family photo albums he'd lovingly kept intact. My mother stormed out before Mr. Goldstein could finish, slamming the oak door in a fury. Afterward, Mr. Goldstein handed me a sealed envelope, a personal letter from Grandpa, meant to be read in private. That night, alone in what was now my home, I opened his letter. In his familiar handwriting, a bit shaky from the illness, he explained everything. He explained how he had loaned my mother money over the years, all unpaid, bailing her out of gambling debts, and even selling priceless family heirlooms to support her lavish lifestyle. The letter ended with words I'll never forget. "You were never just my granddaughter. You were the daughter of my heart. Trust yourself as I've trusted you." I was 27, freshly graduated with my accounting degree, and stuck in an entry-level job at a local firm. The inheritance meant security, opportunity, and a chance to honor Grandpa's legacy. 3 days after the funeral, the first call came. My mother, suddenly concerned about medical bills that needed urgent attention. When I asked for details, the story changed. Now it was about needing a new car because hers had broken down. I offered to help find a reasonable replacement for the car, but she hung up before I could say more. This was only the beginning of her relentless, aggressive campaign to seize my inheritance. 3 weeks after Grandpa's funeral, my mother showed up, uninvited. I was sorting through his files when the doorbell rang incessantly, followed by loud, insistent knocking. "Rebecca, open up! It's an emergency." Her voice carried through the door, sharp and urgent, making my heart race. I rushed to open it, my mind racing with thoughts of accidents or illness. But when I opened the door, she was fine, just a little disheveled. She brushed past me into the house, her designer purse clashing with her worn-out jeans and hasty ponytail. "Thank God you're home," she said. "I need your help with something urgent," she said. And that emergency turned out to be her desperate need for a facelift and tummy tuck, which her current boyfriend had allegedly promised to fund. "Mom," I interrupted her, "I'm not paying for cosmetic surgery." Her excitement shifted to wounded betrayal. "I'm not asking for the world, Rebecca, just a small portion of what Grandpa left you." I'm happy to help with legitimate expenses, I offered. If you have medical bills or education costs, we can discuss those. That's when the first tantrum erupted. She paced the room, her voice rising as she listed all her supposed sacrifices as a young mother, claiming how unfair life had been to her, and how selfish I was being with family money. When tears and accusations didn't work, she switched tactics, threatening to contest the will, claiming Grandpa wasn't of sound mind when he made it. He was on meds in the hospital, she argued. Any court would see he wasn't thinking clearly. I didn't tell her about the video Mr. Goldstein had smartly recorded 6 months before Grandpa's diagnosis, where he clearly laid out his wishes while in perfect health. She left that day without the check she came for, but this was only the beginning of a much longer campaign. Within days, my Aunt Susan, my mother's older sister, called to check on me and casually suggested that sharing some of the inheritance with my mother might keep the peace in the family. Uncle Robert followed with the same sentiment, though his unease was clear, even over the phone. Then came the text messages from Carl, my mother's boyfriend of 2 years. Your mom's really struggling, Rebecca. Families should stick together. It'd be a shame if this got ugly when it doesn't have to. Over the next month, I started piecing together the truth about my mother's financial mess through conversations with family and some truly disturbing discoveries. She had maxed out multiple credit cards, was facing eviction for unpaid rent, and owed a significant amount to people Carl referred to as business associates, though I suspected they were just loan sharks or gambling creditors. The situation took a sharp turn when I received a call from a credit card company about suspicious activity. Someone had tried to open a high-limit credit card in my name, using my social security number and personal details. Luckily, the fraud department caught it because the mailing address didn't match my records. It was my mother's address. When I confronted her on the phone, she broke down in tears, claiming desperate circumstances, promising it would never happen again. I wanted to believe her, but there was something in her rehearsed apologies that just didn't sit right. That same day, I filed fraud alerts with all 3 credit bureaus. 2 weeks later, my workplace became her next target. I was in the middle of a client meeting when our receptionist, Lindsay, came in to tell me my mother was in the lobby, insisting it was an emergency. By the time I excused myself and reached the reception, my mother was loudly telling anyone who'd listen that I was hoarding her rightful inheritance while she was facing homelessness. My boss, Jessica, was understanding but concerned. Your personal life is your business, Rebecca, but we can't have scenes like this disrupting the office, she said privately. After security had escorted my mother out, Jessica asked, "Is there anything I can do to help?" The humiliation cut deep. I'd worked tirelessly to build a solid professional reputation, and within just 10 minutes, my mother was threatening to destroy it all. Then came the social attack. Friends began receiving messages from my mother, filled with carefully spun tales about my supposed breakdown after Grandpa's death, my irrational behavior, and how concerned she was for my mental health. Most saw through it, but constantly defending myself and explaining myself to others drained me and left me more isolated than ever. I stopped answering unknown calls, scaled back my social media, and started avoiding gatherings where I might be bombarded with questions, or worse, run into my mother. My cousin Emma called to warn that things were getting worse behind the scenes. Aunt Jean had been talking to Uncle Robert about hiring lawyers, mentioning something about grounds to contest the will. "She's serious, Becca," Emma warned me. So when my mother's text arrived, inviting me to a family dinner at Aunt Susan's house to make peace, my instincts screamed to stay away. But there was a small part of me still yearning for her mother's approval, hoping for genuine reconciliation. "I think we've both said things we regret," her message read. "Let's talk like adults over dinner. Just family, I promise." I spent days deliberating, finally deciding to go, but I was ready. I slipped a digital recorder into my purse, texted Emma the address and time, with instructions to call if she didn't hear from me by 9 p.m. I drove to Aunt Susan's, my stomach tied in knots. As I turned onto the tree-lined street, the number of cars parked outside Aunt Susan's modest home immediately set off alarm bells in my head. This wasn't just family, as promised. My mother's red convertible was parked next to Uncle Robert's SUV, and two unfamiliar cars sat in the driveway. A black Mercedes and a gray Lexus, cars that screamed professionals, not family. I sat in my car for 5 long minutes, contemplating driving away. With a deep breath, I steeled myself and walked toward the front door. The moment I stepped into Aunt Susan's house, the conversation in the living room halted. 6 pairs of eyes turned toward me, and the silence pressed against me like a heavy weight. The smell of Aunt Susan's lasagna wafted from the kitchen, but it did nothing to ease the tension in the air. My mother stood up from the sofa, her smile stretched too wide, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Rebecca, you made it," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I quickly scanned the room. Mother, standing, her eyes darting nervously toward Aunt Susan by the dining room entrance. Uncle Robert, awkwardly standing by the fireplace. Carl, leaning against the wall, arms crossed. And 2 strangers, middle-aged, sharply dressed, sitting stiffly on the love seat. "Sorry I'm late," I said, though I was actually on time. Traffic was worse than expected. Aunt Susan rushed forward, pulling me into a hug that was just a bit too tight, her whispered words carrying a hidden weight. "I'm so glad you came," she said, but there was an undercurrent in her voice I couldn't quite place. "Rebecca, I'd like you to meet some friends of the family," my mother said smoothly, her voice as cold as her smile as she gestured toward the well-dressed strangers. "This is Mr. Peterson and Miss Jenkins," she continued. "They've been helping me sort through some important paperwork." Mr. Peterson stood. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Rebecca. Your mother speaks very highly of you," he said. Miss Jenkins merely nodded, her gaze sharp and assessing as she narrowed her eyes at me. "Dinner's ready," Aunt Susan announced with a forced cheerfulness that didn't fool anyone. "Let's sit down before it gets cold." The dining table was set with Aunt Susan's good china, the kind saved for Thanksgiving and Christmas. Another red flag that this wasn't just a simple family dinner. I was directed to a seat between Uncle Robert and Mr. Peterson, right across from my mother, Carl, and Miss Jenkins. Aunt Susan took the head of the table, her hands nervously fidgeting with her napkin. The conversation during dinner was painfully superficial. Weather, local sports teams, a new restaurant downtown. No one mentioned Grandpa, the inheritance, or the true purpose of this gathering. My mother kept refilling everyone's wine glasses, though she barely touched her own. As Aunt Susan cleared away the dessert plates, my mother set her napkin down with deliberate care, as if preparing for a big reveal. "Well, I think it's time we finally discussed why we're all here," she said, her voice slipping into a more calculated tone. Mr. Peterson opened a sleek leather portfolio I hadn't noticed earlier, pulling out several official-looking documents. "Rebecca, your mother's been quite concerned about how your grandfather's estate is being distributed," he said, his voice smooth, but with an edge. "That's putting it mildly," my mother interjected with a tight, humorless laugh. "We've prepared some documents," Miss Jenkins continued smoothly, her voice like silk. "These documents will create a more equitable arrangement for the family," she said smoothly, as if this was all very normal. Mr. Peterson slid the papers across the table with a practiced motion. "It's really quite straightforward. These documents establish a family trust to manage your grandfather's assets. All family members will benefit fairly." I glanced at Uncle Robert, whose gaze was fixed firmly on his coffee cup, avoiding my eyes. Aunt Susan still hadn't returned from the kitchen. "These are just formalities," my mother said, impatience creeping into her voice. "A way to make things fair." I looked down at the first page, skimming through the dense legal jargon. Despite the convoluted wording, the intent was clear as day. I would be signing over control of all the assets to a family trust, with my mother as the primary trustee. In essence, I'd be handing everything over to my mother. "Take your time," Miss Jenkins said, though her finger tapping on the table suggested she didn't mean it. "But we do need to file these promptly to avoid further complications," she added. "Complications?" I asked, my voice steady as I looked up from the document. "Legal challenges can be lengthy and expensive," Mr. Peterson explained with a sympathetic smile. My mother's facade of pleasantness was thinning by the second. "Just sign it, Rebecca," she said, pushing a pen toward me. "Stop being so difficult. This is what family does." "I'd like to read through everything first," I said, flipping to the second page. "We don't have all night," Miss Jenkins remarked with poorly concealed irritation. My mother's mask finally slipped entirely. "This is ridiculous. You're sitting on over $1 million that should have been shared with me from the beginning. I'm your mother, for God's sake." "A mother who abandoned her at 8, Uncle Robert muttered, surprising everyone, including himself. "Stay out of this, Robert," my mother snapped before turning back to me. "Sign the papers, or we'll contest the will and tie you up in court for years. By the time the lawyers are done, there won't be anything left for either of us." My heart hammered in my chest. The room seemed to shrink, air thinning as panic rose in my throat. My vision tunneled briefly, the faces around the table blurring except for my mother's, sharp with anticipation and triumph. In that moment, I heard Grandpa's voice again, clear as day. "When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." The documents before me suddenly seemed absurd. A transparent attempt to steal what Grandpa had explicitly wanted me to have. A strange calm washed over me, replacing the panic of moments before. I smiled. Everyone at the table looked confused by this unexpected reaction. My mother's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Before I sign anything," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I should probably call Mr. Goldstein. He specifically warned me about this scenario." The mention of Mr. Goldstein's name was like dropping a stone into still water. Ripples of reaction spread across every face at the table. My mother's complexion paled visibly, her confidence faltering for the first time that evening. "That won't be necessary," Mr. Peterson said quickly. "We can address any concerns you have right here." I allowed my smile to widen slightly. "I'm afraid I disagree. You see, Mr. Goldstein and I had a very specific conversation about the possibility of my mother attempting to contest the will or pressure me into relinquishing the inheritance." I turned directly to my mother. He showed me the provisions Grandpa included precisely to prevent the situation. "Did you know that if you formally contest the will, your $50,000 inheritance automatically goes to the Children's Hospital Foundation?" Grandpa thought of everything. Miss Jenkins and Mr. Peterson exchanged glances, a silent communication that suggested this was news to them. "That's ridiculous," my mother sputtered, but the uncertainty in her voice betrayed her. I reached slowly into my purse, noting how everyone tensed as if I might pull out a weapon. Instead, I placed my small digital recorder on the table, its red light blinking steadily. "I've been recording since I arrived," I said calmly. Carl stepped forward. "I also have documentation of every attempt my mother has made to harass me about the inheritance," I continued, pulling out my phone, "including the text from you, Carl. That could easily be construed as extortion. My lawyer suggested we might have grounds for a restraining order, especially after the scene at my workplace." I scrolled through my phone casually. "Speaking of lawyers, mine is waiting for my call." I told him I'd check in by 9 to let him know everything was okay. Mr. Peterson closed his portfolio with a snap. "Miss Parker, it seems there's been a misunderstanding about the purpose of tonight's meeting." "Has there?" I asked, producing one more item from my purse. A folded copy of Grandpa's will, which I'd begun carrying with me everywhere. "Because this document is very clear about my grandfather's intentions, would you like me to read the relevant section?" It's quite specific. Without waiting for a response, I unfolded the document and found the passage I'd practically memorized. I leave the remainder of my estate, including my home, investments, business interests, and personal property, to my granddaughter, Rebecca Parker, who has been the joy of my life, and whose judgment I trust implicitly. I make this bequest with full knowledge of my daughter Jean's expectations, which I have chosen not to fulfill due to her persistent financial irresponsibility and disregard for family obligations. I looked up. There's more, including a detailed letter explaining his decision that's been filed with the probate court. I reached back into my purse and withdrew an envelope. The personal letter Grandpa had left me, which I brought on instinct. He wrote me a private letter too. Would you like to hear part of it? Again, I didn't wait for permission. Rebecca, I know John will likely try to convince you I was unfair or confused when making these decisions. The truth is simpler. Over the years, I've given your mother more than $300,000 to cover debts, bail her out of failed ventures, and fund her lifestyle. None was repaid. The last straw came when I discovered she had taken your grandmother's jewelry, pieces I'd saved for you, and sold them for gambling money. My mother's face contorted with rage and embarrassment. He had no right to tell you that. He had every right, I countered quietly, just as I have every right, to honor his wishes by refusing to fund the behavior that disappointed him so deeply. I gathered my belongings and stood. I'm leaving now. You all leave me alone. No more surprise visits, no calls to my workplace, no manipulating family members into pressuring me. If any of that continues, I'll file for a restraining order and pursue any other legal remedies my lawyer recommends. I turned to Mr. Peterson and Miss Jenkins. As for you two, I suggest you research your clients more thoroughly in the future. Attempting to coerce someone into signing away their inheritance could have serious professional consequences. My mother jumped to her feet, chair scraping loudly against the floor. You ungrateful little... Jean, stop. Aunt Susan's voice cut through the tension as she finally emerged from the kitchen. She looked tired but resolute. Rebecca's right. This whole thing was wrong from the start. You planned this, my mother accused, whirling on her sister. I let it happen, Aunt Susan admitted, because you swore it was just going to be a family discussion about sharing some expenses. Not. She gestured at the lawyers and documents. Whatever this turned into. Uncle Robert stood as well, straightening his shoulders. I tried to tell you this wouldn't work, Jean. Dad knew exactly what he was doing with his will. In this moment, my mother looked around the table, searching for allies and finding none. This isn't over, my mother hissed. But her threat sounded hollow even to my ears. I walked to the door, pausing with my hand on the knob. It is over, Mom, I said calmly. Grandpa made his choice, and I'm honoring it. I would have helped you if you'd approached me honestly about real needs. Instead, you tried to take everything, and now you'll get nothing more from me. The night air felt cleansing as I stepped outside, the weight of months of hot chestnut lifting slightly from my shoulders. I made it to my car on steady legs, closed the door, and turned the key in the ignition, before the emotions finally overwhelmed me. I broke down completely once I was safely inside my car and several blocks away from Aunt Susan's house. Violent sobs racked my body, a mixture of relief, grief, and lingering fear, making it impossible to drive further. I pulled into a grocery store parking lot, killed the engine, and let the tears flow freely. The next morning, I called Mr. Goldstein and scheduled an emergency meeting. You did exactly the right thing, he assured me after hearing my account. James worried something like this might happen. That's why we took such care with the will's language and the supporting documentation. We discussed next steps, including filing for a restraining order against both my mother and Carl. Family court judges hate to get involved in inheritance disputes, Mr. Goldstein explained, but threats and hockey assessment crossed the line from civil to potentially criminal matters. The paperwork was filed that afternoon. I left feeling more secure, but also deeply sad that it had come to legal protections against my own mother. That sadness deepened when I opened Facebook later that evening to find my mother had launched a public campaign against me. Her status update, already gathering sympathetic comments, portrayed her as a mother abandoned by an ungrateful daughter who was hoarding a family fortune while she faced homelessness. "Can you believe Rebecca won't help her own mother?" she wrote. "After all, I sacrificed raising her alone after her father abandoned us. Now she has millions from my father and won't spare a dime for the woman who gave her life." The blatant rewriting of history. She hadn't raised me. Grandpa had was infuriating. But Mr. Goldstein had advised against engaging in public arguments. "That's exactly what she wants," he warned. "Documentation, not confrontation, is your best defense." Still, the damage was done. Family members chose sides with most distant relatives, accepting my mother's version without question. Uncle Robert called to apologize for his initial involvement. "Your grandfather was right about everything," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I should have stood up to Jean years ago, but it was easier to go along. I'm sorry, Rebecca." Aunt Susan arrived at my door 3 days later with a box of old family photos she'd kept separate from the ones my mother might have accessed. "These belong with you," she said. "James gave them to me for safekeeping years ago, worried your mother might sell them like she did so many other family mementos." The pictures, my grandmother as a young bride, Grandpa in his army uniform, my mother as an innocent child, provided a bittersweet glimpse into a family history that now felt fractured beyond repair. Cousin Emma proved to be my staunchest ally, defending me fiercely in family group chats and social media. "I've seen how Aunt Jean treated Rebecca our whole lives," she wrote in one particularly heated exchange. "The only person entitled to that inheritance is the one who actually cared for Grandpa James until his last breath, and that's Rebecca." Despite this support, the emotional toll was immense. I installed a security system after finding my mother had attempted to enter the house using an old key while I was at work. The locksmith who changed all the locks looked concerned when I explained the situation. "Family trouble is the worst kind," he said sympathetically. "My sister didn't speak to me for 5 years after our mom passed. Money does strange things to people." Mr. Goldstein sent a formal cease and desist letter to both my mother and her lawyers, outlining the legal consequences of continued harassment or attempts to contest the will. A week later, he called with news. "Miss Jenkins has withdrawn as your mother's counsel," he reported with satisfaction. Apparently, once she realized the full situation, she wasn't comfortable proceeding. "That's a win for us. Reputable attorneys don't like being involved in cases that could lead to ethics complaints." I took practical steps to protect myself financially, placing freezes on my credit, moving my accounts to a different bank than the one my mother used, and documenting every interaction, no matter how small. The constant vigilance was exhausting but necessary. Sleep became elusive. I jolted awake at every noise, convinced my mother or Carl had somehow gotten into the house. Dr. Williams, the therapist I started seeing weekly, diagnosed me with situational anxiety and helped me develop coping strategies. "What you're experiencing is essentially an ongoing trauma response," she explained during one session. "Your brain perceives a constant threat, which is actually rational given the circumstances, but we need to create spaces of safety for you to recover." One of her suggestions was to consider selling Grandpa's house and moving somewhere my mother wouldn't immediately think to look. The idea was painful. The house contained so many memories of Grandpa. But after thinking about it, it was probably the best idea. The final confrontation came unexpectedly at the police station itself. I was there filing an additional report after my mother had left threatening voicemails, despite the restraining order. As I exited the police building, She was waiting in the parking lot. Are you happy now? You've turned the whole family against me, stolen what should have been mine, and now you're trying to have me arrested. I said nothing, fishing for my keys while keeping her in my peripheral vision. I'm giving you one last chance, she continued, her voice rising. Share the inheritance like you should have from the beginning, and I'll forgive all this nonsense. Otherwise, you're no longer my daughter. The ultimatum meant to devastate me instead brought a strange sense of clarity. Looking at the angry woman before me, I realized I'd been mourning the mother I wished I had, not the one who actually existed. Goodbye, Jean, I said calmly, using her first name for the first time in my life. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of her stunned expression in my rearview mirror. It was the last time I would see her for nearly 2 years. 6 months after the confrontation at the police station, I stood in the empty living room of my new condo. The space was nothing like Grandpa's home. It was modern, secure, and most importantly, my mother had no idea where to find me. I had sold the family house to a young couple expecting their first child. It felt right somehow that another family would fill those rooms with new memories. The proceeds from the sale, combined with some of the investment funds, allowed me to put a substantial down payment on this 2-bedroom condo in a secure building with underground parking and a doorman. I donated most of Grandpa's furniture to veterans organizations, but kept special pieces. His reading chair, the oak desk where he taught me bookkeeping, and the handmade quilt my grandmother had created. I had also decided to start my own accounting practice, focusing on small businesses and contractors like Grandpa. Parker Financial Services launched with 5 clients, former business associates of Grandpa's, who trusted his judgment enough to give his granddaughter a chance. Their recommendation brought others, and within months, I was busy enough to consider hiring an assistant. Dr. Williams continued to help me process the trauma of my mother's betrayal and the complicated grief of losing both my grandfather and any illusion of a healthy relationship with my mother. A new relationship also entered my life unexpectedly. Thomas, a civil engineer who had consulted on one of my clients' projects, asked me to coffee after our 3rd professional meeting. His quiet intelligence and genuine interest in my thoughts rather than my circumstances was refreshingly different from previous relationships. When I finally told him about my family situation after several weeks of dating, his response was simple but profound. Thank you for trusting me with that story. It explains your strength. With Thomas, I began exploring hobbies Grandpa had always encouraged. We visited places Grandpa had always talked about seeing, but never reached. The redwood forests of Northern California, the rugged Washington coast, the painted hills of Eastern Oregon. I brought his fishing hat along on these journeys, sometimes placing it in photos as a silent acknowledgement of his continued presence in my life. In January, nearly 18 months after our last encounter, I received a letter with no return address. The handwriting was instantly recognizable. My mother's. For days I left it unopened on my kitchen counter, anxiety spiking whenever I passed it. Thomas offered to read it first, but this was something I needed to face myself. The letter was postmarked from Arizona and written on stationery from a rehabilitation facility. My mother explained she had hit rock bottom after our last confrontation, gambling away the $50,000 inheritance and accumulating dangerous debts. After what she called a wake-up call, which I later learned was an arrest for theft, she had entered treatment for gambling addiction and alcoholism. I don't expect forgiveness, she wrote. I probably don't deserve it, but I am sorry, truly sorry, for everything I've done to hurt you. I waited a month before sending a brief reply, acknowledging her treatment and wishing her well, but establishing clear boundaries about my willingness to re-engage. It was the beginning of a very cautious, very distant relationship, conducted entirely through occasional letters. The anniversary of Grandpa's death brought a pilgrimage to his grave with flowers, lilies, his favorite. I sat on the cold ground, telling him about the business, the scholarship, Thomas, and all the other developments in a life that was finally thriving rather than just surviving. My tears flowing freely, but without the sting of grief. This was something else. Gratitude, connection, and the certainty that the best parts of him continued through me. 2 years after the confrontation at Aunt Susan's house, Parker Financial Services had grown into a respected firm with 4 employees and a client list that had doubled quarterly. The office space I'd leased downtown featured brick walls, hardwood floors, and large windows. My personal transformation had been equally significant. The timid, conflict-avoidant young woman who had once feared her mother's disapproval had become someone who confidently set boundaries, trusted her judgment, and built a life aligned with her values rather than others' expectations. The business allowed me to honor Grandpa's legacy in practical ways. We specialized in helping small construction companies and skilled trades people manage their finances, offering sliding scale rates for startups founded by women and minorities. Most important, my relationship with my mother had evolved into something neither of us could have predicted. After completing her rehabilitation program, she had remained in Arizona, finding work as an administrative assistant at a senior living community. Our communication, once limited to occasional letters, had gradually included phone calls on birthdays and major holidays. There was no pretense of a complete reconciliation or a return to conventional mother-daughter closeness. Too much damage had occurred for that. Instead, we had established a careful relationship based on clear boundaries and limited expectations. "I'm not the mother you deserved," she acknowledged during one phone call. "I can't change the past, but I'm trying to be someone who at least doesn't make your present worse." It was perhaps the most honest statement she'd ever made to me, and I appreciated it more than declarations of maternal love that had proven hollow throughout my childhood. When she asked if she could visit Portland, I suggested meeting at a restaurant, rather than my home, a boundary she respected without complaint, another sign of genuine change. Our lunch was awkward but civil, the conversation carefully navigating around trigger topics like money or Grandpa's will. Before leaving, she handed me a small box. "I found this in a pawn shop in Phoenix," she explained. I recognized it immediately. Inside was my grandmother's pearl bracelet, one of the pieces my mother had sold years earlier for gambling money. The effort to find and repurchase it, while a small gesture compared to the harm done, represented more meaningful amends than grand apologies or promises. Aunt Susan had gradually become the maternal figure I'd always needed, our Sunday dinners evolving into a cherished ritual. She'd recently started dating a kind-hearted retired teacher who treated her with the respect she deserved, and seeing her happiness brought me joy. Uncle Robert and I had developed a comfortable relationship built largely around memories of Grandpa and appreciation for craft beer. Thomas had become my partner in every sense, moving into the condo after a year of dating. When he proposed during a weekend photography trip to the coast, that moment felt blessed by a presence I couldn't see. My engagement ring wasn't a traditional diamond, but a sapphire like the one in my grandmother's gold band. Cousin Emma, who had stood by me throughout the inheritance drama, was the first person I called with the news. We planned a small wedding at Trillium Lake, where Grandpa had taught me to fish, and where Thomas and I had spent countless weekends photographing dawn reflections on the water. My life had found balance that once seemed impossible. The panic attacks that had plagued me after the confrontation had faded with time and therapy. On a bright spring morning, I sat in my home office looking at expansion plans for the business. His photo watched over me from a simple frame on the desk, his expression serious, but with the hint of a smile in his eyes that those who loved him always recognized. Sometimes I could almost hear him chuckling with satisfaction at how things had turned out. Thanks for watching. Take care.